background to why I wanted to work on Moffett, I had written a history of the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia, and a lot of people say, well, what Naval Aircraft Factory? Well, there was only one Naval Aircraft Factory that was owned and operated by the Navy. And in dealing with the Naval Aircraft Factory, especially following World War I, where the American aircraft industry was really tanking at that point, there was a problem that the private manufacturers felt as far as government competition by the Navy with the Naval Aircraft Factory. And just at about that point, Moffett became chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, and he inherited this problem. And he came up with a compromise whereby the Naval Aircraft Factory would produce a limited number of airplanes, would design and manufacture a limited number of these, hand those designs over to private manufacturers to mass produce. That's where the money was. So I ran into Moffett as a consequence of that compromise that he worked out. And at that point I thought I really knew a lot about Moffett. And then when I decided to go ahead with the biography of Moffett, I found out about how little I knew about the guy. So it was very much a learning experience for me, as all my books have been, that's for sure. Another thing that intrigued me about Moffett was that it was an opportunity to say some things about naval aviation history, to use him as a vehicle for trying to understand aspects of naval aviation history. So that's really what I tried to do with this biography more than anything else. Moffett, as you know, was born in Charleston. He was born on October 31st of 1869 in Charleston on Halloween. He was one of 9 children. His father died at age 5 and left his mother mostly destitute in Charleston with 9 children. So it was a very rough beginning as far as his life was concerned. Most of you are probably generally familiar with that. He went to the Naval Academy at age 16 in 1886, graduated from the Academy in 1890. In the upper right-hand corner is the old quarters at the Naval Academy. Those buildings are still standing next to the parade ground at the Academy in Annapolis. Graduated in 1890. The class of 1890 was a total of 34. So you get an idea about how small this was and how intimate that community was. He graduated 31st, so he wasn't exactly the anchor of the class, but it was close. He went on to a fairly typical naval career, which meant you spent a lot of time at sea. One of the highlights of his early naval career was that he was on the cruiser Chicago. The cruiser Chicago was commanded by Alfred Thayer Mahan. Some of you may be familiar with Mahan. He was the theorist of sea power. He wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890 and was commanding officer of the Chicago on a cruise to the Mediterranean and to Europe in 1893 and 1894. And Moffett was on that cruise for a number of years. The interesting thing about this was that Alfred Thayer Mahan was just about the worst naval officer you could possibly imagine. He had a habit of providing unsolicited advice to his senior officers. He belittled his junior officers and his crew. And here was Moffett on this cruise with Chicago to Europe during those years. And probably what happened here was that he learned how not to be a naval officer as a result. So it was a negative lesson as far as he was concerned in leadership. But nevertheless, it was still an opportunity for him to see a great deal of the world as a consequence of this. In 1902, Moffett married Jeanette Whitten. Jeanette Whitten was a Canadian, you probably know this story as well, was a Canadian born in London. They met in New York through Moffett's sister. And one of the interesting things about this is that Moffett at that time was 32 and Jeanette was 16. They went ahead and had 6 children, as you know, three sons and 3 daughters by 1918. So that was his private life at home. He went on to become the executive officer of the Maryland. The Maryland was a battleship. He was executive officer between 1908 and 1909. Executive officer of a ship is one of the hardest jobs you can have. It's kind of like being a department chair in history. You have a whole lot of responsibility and perhaps not as much authority as you would like to have. And really he gained a reputation here as exec on the Maryland for that kind of administrative capability and that kind of leadership that really stood out. It really was a showboat in many ways, going up and down the East Coast when it was a very efficient, it was known as an efficient and happy ship at this point, so that was really important. Then he became commanding officer of the cruiser Chester in 1913 and was commanding officer through 1914, or at least most of 1914. And it was really as commanding officer of the Chester, and this image shows the Chester about that time. It was really as commanding officer of the Chester that he earned his reputation as a hero. This was a time when the United States was very much concerned, the Wilson administration was very much concerned about unrest in Mexico and almost continual revolution in Mexico, and especially arms shipments that were coming through Veracruz to support some of the revolutionaries there. As a consequence, the Navy decided, the Wilson administration through the Navy decided that they would occupy the port facilities of Veracruz, would occupy the customs house of Veracruz, which of course meant the Marines had to go ashore. Moffett and the Chester supported that operation, and in fact in a remarkable operation he was able to navigate the Chester into the harbor of Veracruz under fire, and then provide supporting fire for the Marines ashore at Veracruz. And as a consequence of that, he earned the Congressional Medal of Honor and was really nationally recognized as a hero as a consequence of that. Now, you have to qualify this a little bit because in 1914, if you were going to earn a medal, the only medal you could earn was the Congressional Medal of Honor. There wasn't a hierarchy of medals at that point. So that Congressional Medal of Honor was important, but perhaps not as important as we think of them today. Then, as you know, he spent a good deal of time north of Chicago at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. He went there in 1914 after he had been commanding officer of the Chester. The Great Lakes Naval Station expanded tremendously, especially after 1917 and during World War I. And he was responsible for much of that expansion. He was responsible for administering that. So he had this heroic side to him, and he also had a managerial and administrative side that really stood out at this point, and especially stood out as far as Great Lakes Naval Training Station was concerned. Something like 125,000 trainees went through Great Lakes between 1917 and 1918 and the end of the war. It was also at Great Lakes that he was first introduced to aviation. And he was introduced to aviation through the guy you see here in the lower left-hand corner. This was Philip Wrigley. That name should be familiar to people from the Chicago area. Philip Wrigley was the son of William Wrigley of chewing gum fame. And he was very much interested, as many young people were at that time, in aviation. He talked to Moffett and they established an aviation flight school at Great Lakes in 1917. Now it didn't last very long. It lasted only into 1918, largely because of the bad weather that you had there. But this introduced Moffett to aviation, and it also cemented some of the relationships that he had with the Wrigley family, and that stood throughout his naval career. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see Moffett with his eldest daughter, Janet. This is at their house outside, their house in Lake Forest, very near the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. As far as I know, that's one of the few Moffett houses that's still standing. When I was working on the Moffett book, I would go around to various places where I knew his houses were, and they were always torn down, and there was something else there. So that house in Lake Forest is still there. So this was important. This really did two things for him. It established his administrative credentials, and it also provided some of the political connections that he had through the Wrigley family and in the Chicago area that were very important for his later career. His aviation career continued when he became commanding officer of the battleship Mississippi. The Mississippi was one of the newest, fastest battleships in the Navy at this time, in the early 1920s. And everybody in the Navy at that point, if you wanted to achieve any rank whatsoever, had to achieve a battleship command. So in many ways, as a captain, this was the apex of his seagoing career as commanding officer of the Mississippi. That was 1918, 1920. Also here, he extended his interest in aviation. He met a pioneer naval aviator named Henry Mustin. And Henry Mustin was very much convinced that aviation and airplanes had to be taken to sea. And what they did on the Mississippi, and they did this on other battleships as well, was to build flying off platforms over the battleship's turrets. And you would fly off a small fighter aircraft, basically, or a scout aircraft. It would provide scouting for the fleet. It would also provide spotting for gunfire. And Mustin and Moffett worked very closely with these flying off platforms on the Mississippi in various exercises that they did. Mustin became an important figure as well, because when Moffett became chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, he invited Mustin to become the assistant chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. So that connection with Mustin was extremely important. Maybe you know this, but Mustin Field at the Naval Aircraft Factory was named for Henry Mustin. Moffett then became Director of Naval Aviation. This was an office within the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. And it really wasn't a very important appointment in many ways for a senior captain, and you would think this would be the end of his career. But it was important in a number of ways. First, it kept him involved in this new technology. And he recognized he recognized how important this new technology was. He was very much a visionary in terms of understanding what the airplane and aviation could do. It also meant that he was directly responsible to the Chief of Naval Operations. So he had a direct pipeline to some of the highest operational leadership within the Navy at that point as well, in that period between 1920 and 1921. What happened next is really complicated. What happened next was that a number of people within the Navy recognized that if naval aviation was going to go anywhere, and especially if it were going to achieve something in relation to Army aviation, and there was a great deal of pressure here from somebody named Billy Mitchell in 1919, 1920, and on into 1921 to subsume all of the Navy's aviation into a unified Air Force that would be essentially run by Billy Mitchell. When many Navy people recognized this, they said, hey, look, if we are going to have any kind of credibility here, what we've got to do is put our house in order. What we have to do is consolidate all of aviation within the Navy into a separate bureau. And at this point, by 1921, naval aviation was separated among various bureaus. The Bureau of Engineering, for example, was responsible for motors, engines. The Bureau of Construction and Repair was responsible for building airframes. The Bureau of Navigation was responsible for personnel. Why is it doing that? We've got a USB connection.
Swipe the screen.
Just swipe the screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
If that doesn't...
And then you go back. So what they recognized was significant here was to put naval aviation's house in order, essentially to create a new bureau responsible entirely for aeronautics. And that was the Bureau of Aeronautics that was created in 1921. Moffett worked behind the scenes politically to make sure that this was going to happen. And because he was Director of Naval Aviation, he became the first Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. That was brought together, that consolidated all aspects of naval aviation into a separate bureau, and Moffett was in charge of it. Also, it meant that he had flag rank. He became an admiral as a consequence of this. The heads of various bureaus were all flag ranks at that time. Another development took place in the summer of 1921, and that was a series of experiments, bombing experiments off the Virginia Capes. What the Navy wanted to do in the aftermath of World War I was to determine what kind of damage would be done to capital ships, battleships, by aerial bombing, and put together a series of experiments with captured German warships off the Virginia Capes. It was entirely a naval operation, a naval experiment, but it was also joint in the sense that Billy Mitchell and Army bombers were going to be involved with these experiments as well. The idea was that these bombing runs would be made. Bombs would be dropped on some of these ships or near some of these ships. Then you would stop the bombing. And at that point, a party would go aboard each one of the ships to determine how much damage had been done. It was very carefully laid out by the Navy. Well, you know what Billy Mitchell did? He launched his bombers. They bombed one of the captured German warships, a battleship actually, and sank it before there could be any kind of damage assessment whatsoever. And as a consequence of that, I'm going to work on this a little bit. I don't I don't usually work with mics. I really don't like them very much. I'm pretty good at yelling at students. As a consequence of that, Mitchell now had a propaganda coup. He went around telling people that he had sunk battleships. He went around telling people that the Navy was obsolete and that you didn't have to have the Navy as the first line of defense anymore. All you needed was Army bombers at this point. And that was something that really began a feud, if you will, between Mitchell and Moffett that went on through the early, from the early 1920s to the middle part of the decade. The Washington Conference was also important. Moffett, as the chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, participated in the Washington Conference for naval limitation. He was on a subcommittee that worked on aircraft limitations and worked on aircraft carriers and limiting them as much as possible. And as a consequence of coming out of the Washington Conference, he understood that he would only be able to build so many tons, total tons of aircraft carriers. And that meant that he had to, in making a determination about how many of these ships he was going to build, he had to understand that you could only build so many within that total tonnage limitation. He was always working these numbers as far as the number of platforms you could have within those limitations. And I got to go the other way, don't I? Which button did I push? I'm all right. During the early part of the 1920s, Moffett fought what I refer to as a three-front war. The first people he had to confront were the naval aviators, those pioneer aviators who were true believers in naval aviation. And many of those people wanted to separate naval aviation from the Navy, establish a separate corps, if you will, of naval aviation, much like the Marine Corps. And that was something that was anathema to Moffett. He wanted to integrate aviation into the Navy. He didn't want to have a separate Marine Corps type naval aviation corps. And as a consequence of that, he talked to naval aviators. He said, hey, look, if you are really, and we are really as good as we think we are, eventually we're not going to need a corps. We'll take over the Navy. And that was really more than anything else what happened here in terms of assuaging some of the concerns that some of these true believers, these naval aviators had. He also said that senior officers in the Bureau of Aeronautics are going to learn to fly. And he himself went to Pensacola in 1922 and became a naval aviation observer, not actually flying, but still operating airplanes extensively. The second front that he had to fight was with primarily the gun club, if you want to call it, within the Navy itself. Those were the battleship admirals. Those were the people who were really adamant about naval aviation and especially didn't want to have airplanes on their ships, let me put it that way. And he also had to fight within that system that the Navy had, the Bureau of Navigation. The Bureau of Navigation was responsible for, among many things, personnel. And he had a running battle throughout the 1920s with the Bureau of Navigation about the assignment of aviation personnel. The Bureau of Navigation insisted that some of these aviators had to spend a lot of time at sea. And Moffett said, hey, wait a minute, if they're spending a lot of time at sea, then that means they're not going to be flying, and I want to have these people flying. And that was a battle that he fought throughout the 1920s. And then finally, he had the battle with the Army, and especially the battle with Billy Mitchell that went on to 1925. And as you can see here, this is Billy Mitchell and his court-martial in 1925. Mitchell insisted that that naval aviation be subsumed within an overall unified Air Force that primarily would be run by Army people. And this was something that Moffett fought tooth and nail throughout the 1920s, down to the court-martial of Mitchell in 1925. Let me make sure I get the right arrow here. This then led, oh, it's sliding out. It keeps disconnecting. And the microphone's going every which way. Anyway, ultimately this came to a head in what I refer to as the crisis of 1925. Two things happened in 1925. One of them was a flight that was made, an attempted flight that was made from the West Coast to Hawaii. Moffett recognized that if you could fly from the West Coast to Hawaii, it was about 2,100 miles. That was the longest distance on the planet where you had no alternative landing site. He recognized that if you could fly nonstop, obviously, from San Francisco, say, to Hawaii, you could fly anywhere on the planet. So in 1925, they organized a flight by the PN-9, and you can see here in the lower left-hand corner, the PN-9 flying boat, to fly from the west coast of Hawaii. Everything went fine until it went down about 200 miles off course and was lost, essentially, for days in 1925. Everyone assumed that because it was lost, these aviators would never be found again. Actually, what they wound up doing was removing parts of the fabric on the lower wing of the airplane and finally sailing that 200 miles to Hawaii. And it was just an epic adventure, if you will, and also underscored why naval officers had to be good sailors as well. But as far as anybody was concerned, as far as everybody was concerned, the PN-9 had been, and its crew had been lost. At the same time that was happening, the airship Shenandoah went down in a storm over southeastern Ohio, killing 14 of the crew members. So here were multiple disasters that took place in 1925. That then led Mitchell to say, and here is where Mitchell wound up in conflict with his own service. This was where Mitchell said, these accidents that happened to the Navy, the Hawaii flight, to the Shenandoah disaster, were the result of criminal negligence within the Navy and in the Army. Now, an Army officer may be able to get away with saying there's criminal negligence within the Navy, but not going to be able to get away with saying it's criminal negligence within the Army. As a consequence, they brought court-martial proceedings against him for insubordination and various other crimes against the Army in particular. Court-martial resulted in his removal from active service and reduction in rank, and essentially ended that part of the feud with Billy Mitchell at that point. Another part of this was the establishment of what was known as the Morrow Board. This was headed by Dwight Morrow, who was friends with Calvin Coolidge, the president. And the idea here was to resolve all of these problems relating to aviation as much as possible. And coming out of the Morrow Board was a report that naval aviation would remain within the Navy, and also would be expanded in various ways, and make recommendations that Congress would provide money to expand naval aviation. Moffett then created what some people have referred to as an aviation empire. I've referred to this, and others have referred to this, as a super bureau. And what I mean by that is that rather than simply being a material bureau, only responsible for aircraft and aspects of the material that's necessary for aviation, it would be responsible for planning, organization, and personnel as well. That meant that it would be very much a rival to other bureaus within the Navy, especially the Bureau of Navigation. And Moffett, because of his political connections, because of his capabilities here as a leader, was able to establish the Bureau of Aeronautics as this super bureau. Also sometimes referred to Moffett as an impresario of the air. Not only was he politically savvy, but he also recognized how important public relations were and publicity. He was very much a showman in that sense. And this in the 1920s was an important period where you had motion pictures, you've seen some of those, and it was also a period in which you had popular magazines, newspapers. He recognized how important publicity was for naval aviation. One way of promoting naval aviation was through air racing. And in the early part of the 1920s, the Navy was actively involved in competition in air racing, not just with the Army in particular, but also internationally. That was important to him. And he recognized that if naval aviation was going to succeed, it had to go to sea on the back of the fleet. And what he meant by that was that you had to put airplanes on ships. Not just on aircraft carriers, but on battleships, on cruisers. They even made efforts here to put them on destroyers and submarines during the 1920s. But it was the aircraft carrier more than anything else that took naval aviation to sea, took the airplane to sea, and Moffett worked very hard to see that the aircraft carrier achieved those ends in the 1920s. In 1926, this was coming out of the Morrow Board recommendations, the Navy achieved congressional authorization and funding to manufacture 1,000 airplanes over a 5-year period. Moffett was more than anybody else responsible for drafting the legislation for the 1,000 Airplane Act, made sure that he got it through key members of Congress and got approval for it, and then on a year-to-year basis made sure that they were keeping pace with that 5-year program. That was one of the remarkable political achievements that he had. And Moffett was also responsible for airship development during the 1920s and on into the 1930s. You saw some of that with the airship Akron. You saw the Shenandoah. A second airship was the Los Angeles, which was built in Germany, one of the most successful rigid airships that the Navy operated during that period of time. And the Akron and Macon were essentially big scouting airships. The idea here was that they would essentially substitute for cruisers for long-distance scouting in the Pacific. Cruisers were limited by various limitations of arms agreements in the 1920s. Cruisers were more expensive than these airships, and Moffett really saw the big rigid airship as a substitute for that long-range scouting for the fleet in the 1920s. And then he was also responsible for personnel. Here, he perhaps wasn't as successful as he could have been. It was very difficult to recruit the number of people he needed. It was very difficult to train the number of aviators he needed. He was in constant conflict in many ways with the Bureau of Navigation over the assignment of personnel. And he probably ended his life thinking that I hadn't really achieved as much as I would have liked as far as the personnel aspects of it were concerned. Here's Lieutenant Al Williams. He was the winner of the Pulitzer race in St. Louis in 1923. Moffett was there in 1923 for those races. Al Williams was one of his favorites. After Al Williams won this race, Moffett came right over to his cockpit, took his helmet off, jammed his hat on top, his cap on top of his head, and said, "You're my man. This is really a tremendous achievement that you had in this race." Here's Moffett holding forth with the Shenandoah in the background. This is in San Diego, or outside San Diego in 1924, just after the Shenandoah had made a really epic transcontinental flight from Lakehurst, New Jersey to San Diego, California, with Moffett aboard. Here's the Langley in the upper left-hand corner. This was the Navy's first aircraft carrier. It was a conversion commissioned in 1922. What Langley wanted to do was to show off rigid airships. He also showed off the Langley. This is at the Washington Navy Yard, where they had a celebration for naval aviation and showing off the Langley there at the Washington Navy Yard. And down in the lower right-hand corner is Moffett on board the Langley with the Langley's commanding officer, Joseph Mason Reeves. Joseph Mason Reeves was really a critical person here in terms of some of the tactical development of aircraft carriers, and especially here increasing the efficiency and perhaps even the strike capability that aircraft carriers had. The Akron in 1931, again, the Akron being one of these two big rigid airships, the Akron and the Macon being commissioned in just about a month before the crash of the Akron in 1933. Again, the idea was to have these as substitutes for cruisers, providing long-range scouting for the fleet. And then you've seen this image as well, the tragedy that ultimately befell the Akron on the night of April 3 and 4 of 1933. What Moffett was thinking about here from 1931 down to 1933 was that these airships had to be operated on a regular basis, and he was very much concerned that they would be looked at as fair weather ships that would only go out when the weather was good. They knew that night that there was going to be some bad weather with the Akron, but they didn't think it was going to be as bad as it turned out to be. Actually, what it wound up being was a convergence of fronts that brought about these storms that brought the airship down. But he wanted to try to demonstrate that these ships could fly in all weather, and perhaps that was in some ways the unmaking of the rigid airship era. If Moffett made any big mistakes, and the Navy made any big mistakes, it was committing so much money and effort to these large rigid airships. This at the time was the worst aviation disaster in history. 73 people were killed, only 3 survivors, and of course Moffett was not among those who survived. What did all this mean? It was really hard for me to try to make an assessment or an appreciation of what Moffett meant to naval aviation. I looked at this in terms of a conservative bureaucracy, and in many ways a conservative who was responsible for this bureaucracy, and yet someone who was a visionary who was also committed to change.
And he was able to bring this about because of a unique combination of personality, an ability to understand how people worked, an understanding also of the political dimension that was so necessary. And as he developed all this, he had a following that was really unprecedented. He was able to generate loyalty among not just his people serving under him, but also a loyalty among people in the civilian aspect of aviation. He had lots of friends there in the civilian aspects of aviation and also higher up within the Navy as well. And that to me is a demonstration of leadership that stands out above almost anything else. And he also had an appreciation for technological change, an understanding that technology, especially of aviation and the airplane, as well as the airship to a certain extent, were very important as far as where the Navy was going to go on into the 1930s and beyond. And for that, I've really concluded that he was, at that time, the essential man, the essential person as far as the Navy was concerned and naval aviation. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time that you've taken to be here, and I'll be more than willing to talk to you afterwards. Thank you very much.
We have just a couple of things we need to tell you, and that is that we have to decamp, decamp from this space promptly at 9 p.m. So we have another hour. But whenever we leave, whatever time that is, the plan was to go across the street to 2nd Presbyterian. We have candles for everybody, and we're all